Lot 51 on the Ostrander sale bill got 4 words: Barber chair, does not raise. It stood at the tail end of a row of junk in the wet grass beside an open equipment shed 3 miles east of Wren's Mill on the first Saturday of October, 1990. 380 pounds of cast iron, weight porcelain, and quarter-sawn oak. Sitting flat at its lowest setting because the pump had quit sometime before most of the people at that sale were born. The porcelain on the left arm was chipped through to black metal in the shape of a thumbnail. The leather across the seat had split and was leaking gray horsehair into the grass. The nickel had gone the color of old dimes. The auctioneer asked $50 and got nothing back but the sound of wind in the shed roof. He asked $25. Dale Kreitz, who ran the salvage yard out on the state road and priced everything on this earth by the pound, said it loud enough for 3 rows to hear that he would not haul that thing off if they paid him, because you cannot cut porcelain-clad iron without ruining a good blade. Then a lean old man in blue denim bib overalls and a pale straw hat, who had spent most of the previous hour down on one knee beside that chair with a pocket flashlight, said $45. The yard laughed, not cruelly. It was the good-natured laugh a country auction gives a man who has just bought the joke of the day. Emmett Barlow, 69 years old, 38 of them spent rebuilding hydraulic cylinders for a limestone quarry, let it wash over him, and did not look up. The gavel came down. Somebody clapped. 11 months later, that chair sold in a specialty sale in Chicago for $118,000. And that is not even the part of this story that put a grown man down on a barn floor with his hat in his hands. To understand what Emmett saw that morning, you have to understand what he was kneeling next to, because a chair like that one is not furniture. It is a machine. The weight was not paint, it was porcelain enamel. Powdered glass laid on cast iron and fired in a furnace at around 1,500 degrees until the glass fused to the metal. That is why an 80-year-old barber chair is still bright white, while everything around it in the shed had gone brown. And it is also why the arm was chipped instead of scratched. Fused glass does not fade, and it does not scuff. It chips like a dinner plate. Underneath the white, the pedestal was hollow. Inside that column sat an oil-filled cylinder and a piston, and at the base a foot lever a barber could work with the side of his shoe. Each stroke pushed a measured slug of oil under the piston and lifted the chair, and the customer in it about half an inch. A check valve held the pressure between strokes. A release lever let the oil back down. Everything that made the chair a machine was inside that column, in the dark, where nobody ever looked. Emmett Barlow knew none of the history that morning. What he knew was hydraulics, and here is what he found with the pocket flashlight while everybody else was over at the tractors. He worked the foot lever, and it went down, with no resistance at all. That sounds like a small thing. It is not. A worn cylinder fights you, it pushes back, it bleeds past the piston, it takes the chair up an inch and lets it sag. A cylinder with nothing in it does not fight you at all. The pedal just goes to the floor, easy as a screen door. That is a dry cylinder. And a chair does not drain itself. Somebody drains it. Then he found the second thing. On the back of the pedestal, where there should have been a square head filler plug for topping up the oil, there was no plug. There was a low gray dome of wiped lead, the way an old plumber closes a joint, and 30 coats of black paint over the top of it. And then the third thing, the one he sat with. He tapped the base with the heel of his hand, low down. The way you knock on a cylinder to hear whether it is full. It did not ring like an empty shell. It answered short and flat and dull. He also noticed and mentioned to nobody that the seat sat about a half-inch proud of the frame line on the right-hand side. Drained on purpose, sealed on purpose, painted over on purpose. A man who has spent 38 years listening to iron does not need any more invitation than that. And $45 was what he had folded in his shirt pocket. If you've made it this far into Emmett Barlow's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Getting it home took the rest of the day. His grandson Wes, 19, backed a borrowed grain truck up to the shed, and 4 men walked that chair up a pair of oak planks on furniture rollers, while Dale Crite stood off to one side and offered advice about hernias. It went into the machine shed behind the house, under the good light over the workbench, on a square of old carpet. Nadine Barlow, his wife of 44 years, came out with coffee, looked at it a long moment, and said it was the ugliest thing he had ever brought home, and she had seen the mowing machine. Then he did not touch it for 4 days. That was his way with a job. He had spent 38 years around men who tore into a cylinder in the first hour, and then spent the rest of the week hunting parts they had broken getting in. So instead, he cleaned it. Warm water, dish soap, a toothbrush, and a white came up under his hand a palm's width at a time, until the chair stopped looking like something out of a hayfield. What came up under the soap also told him something about the shop it had stood in. The mechanism in that pedestal came out of the Barber supply houses of St. Louis and Cincinnati in the 1890s, and it changed the trade. Before it, a shop chair was a chair. After it, a shop chair was the most expensive thing most barbers ever bought, sold on installments over 2 and 3 years. Priced above a year of shop rent, stamped with a serial number in the base casting, and finished with a small brass maker's plate screwed under the right arm. There was no plate under the right arm of this one. 4 empty screw holes, clean, no rust bloom in them, and no paint bridging them. Somebody had taken it off with a screwdriver, unhurried, and had not been in a hurry about it. And then there was the seat. Not a cushion, a deep box frame of quarter-sawn oak, webbed underneath, packed with curled horsehair, covered in leather and closed, with several hundred upholstery tacks driven in a line so even it looked machined. Because horsehair packs down and webbing stretches, that box was built to be opened. There is a service panel in the underside of the seat frame for exactly that reason. Emmett noticed it the way you notice a door you are not ready to knock on yet, and went back to the base. The base was the sealed thing. The base was the heavy thing. The base was the obvious thing. That, as it turned out, was the entire point. The chair had come out of Fordyce, up the valley. That much was on the sale bill's front page. The entire contents of 3 barns belonging to the late Warren Ostrander, 91, who for 50 years had bought out closed businesses whole and simply parked them. Lot 51 had a line in the catalog copy, from the Rener, Barbershop, Depot Street, Fordyce. Everybody over 60 in that county knew Reners. Silas Rener cut hair on Depot Street for 51 years, in a narrow shop with a pressed tin ceiling across from a woolen mill that at its best ran 3 shifts. He was known for 2 things. He never raised his price on a boy's haircut, not once, from 1922 forward. And through the long bad stretch in the 50s, when the mill went to 2 shifts and then 1. He cut hair on credit for anybody who asked. and wrote it in a black ledger he kept under the till. The mill closed on a Tuesday in April 1963. Rener's closed the same week. Silas Rener was 77. His wife Ada had died 4 years earlier. They had never had children, and he had a room at his sister's. In November of that same year, a stroke took his speech and the use of his right hand. He lived another 8 years in a county home in Marylebone and died there in 1971 without ever writing another legible word. And the story people told about him, the way small towns tell stories, was that poor old C had died with nothing. 51 years of work, and he did not leave enough to bury himself properly. The county did it. What the valley never quite agreed on was the ledger. Everyone knew he had cut on credit. The argument was over what came back. Some said men who got out and found work in the 60s had mailed money home to that shop for years afterward. Some said there had been a coffee can. When Warren Ostrander bought the contents whole in 1974, he said there was not a dollar in the place, and nobody had a reason to doubt him. Old men in Marylebone were still arguing about it in 1990. Emmett had sat in that chair once. It came up on the second night in the shed, sideways, the way old things do, with a rag in his hand. 1932. He would have been 11. His father hauling crosties up the valley and stopping in Fordyce so the boy could be made presentable for a funeral in Marylebone. He remembered a pressed tin ceiling. He remembered a board laid across the arms for a boy to sit on. And he remembered the floor dropping away underneath him in half-inch jumps, while a man he never saw again worked a lever with the side of his shoe, the only elevator most people in that valley ever rode. He had not recognized the chair at the sale. Nobody would have. 58 years, 3 barns, and a coat of grime is a good disguise. Emmett worked on the base for 9 days. The lead wipe came off with patient heat and a scraper. Under it was the filler port, and under that were 6 square head bolts holding an oval access plate in the back of the pedestal, and every one of them had been set in lead wool and had not moved since Eisenhower. He broke 2 of them off and drilled them. On the 4th night, he was certain he had it. He fed a length of welding rod down through the open filler port, and something in there answered him, a small, hard rattle, loose, rolling away and rolling back. He did not sleep much afterward. It was the check ball out of the valve seat, a steel sphere about the size of a pea, which he found in the dust at the bottom of the shelf 5 nights later and kept in a pill bottle on the windowsill for the rest of his life. On the 9th evening, the plate came away in his hands. Inside was nothing, an iron shell. Dry dust, some mouse chaff, the ghost of old oil. The cylinder standing empty in the middle of it, with its piston seized at the bottom of the stroke. He put the flashlight all the way in and turned it around, and there was nothing in that base but the base. Emmett sat down on an upturned bucket and stayed there a while. Nadine, who had heard the plate come off, waited in the kitchen and did not come out, which he told her later he appreciated. It was while he was wiping the plate down to see whether it was worth saving that the light caught it. On the inside face, the face that had been turned toward the dark for 27 years, somebody had scratched 4 numbers and 2 letters with a machinist scribe. Small and neat and deliberate, the way a tradesman dates his own work so the next man knows. S.R. 4263. Silas Rener. The 2nd of April, 1963. The Tuesday the mill closed. And that is the moment the whole thing turned over, because Emmett Barlow, sitting on a bucket in a cold shed at 11 at night, finally asked the right question. Not what did he hide in there. Why would a 77-year-old man on the worst day of his working life drain the oil out of his own chair, seal the filler with lead, bolt the plate down in lead wool, paint the whole thing black, and sign and date the inside of it for an empty box? You do not seal an empty box unless you want it looked at. The base was not a hiding place. The base was the door you were meant to knock on. Anybody who ever wondered about Silas Rener's money would do exactly what Emmett had just spent 9 days doing. Go at the heavy iron, the sealed part, the obvious part, and find dust and quit. Emmett got up off the bucket, and instead of standing the chair up, he laid it over on its side on the carpet. The seat frame, underside up in the light, told him in about 4 seconds. The tack line along the rear rail was blued steel, bright next to the old coppered tacks that ran everywhere else. And there were far too many of them, doubled up the way a man does when he is not an upholsterer and wants to be sure. The service panel in the oak had been out, and the leather sat proud on the right because whatever went back in under it did not lie as flat as horsehair does. He pulled tacks for 2 hours with a tack lifter and a pair of end nips, saving every single one of them in a coffee cup, because he said afterward that he already had the feeling he was going to want to put that seat back exactly the way he found it. Nadine came out at 1 in the morning with her coat over her nightgown, because the shed lamp was still on, and she had been married long enough to know the difference between a man working and a man finding something. Wes came out because his grandmother woke him. Neither of them said much. The leather came back in one piece, stiff as a saddle, and the horsehair under it lifted out in gray matted slabs. Under the leather, under 3 inches of curled horsehair, screwed flat to the oak with 8 brass wood screws, was a Japan tin document box about the size of a school atlas, wrapped once in oilcloth and taped at the seams with cloth tape gone the color of weak tea. Inside the tin, in order, laid flat, 14 United States Series E savings bonds, bought 1 or 2 at a time between 1957 and April of 1963, each one registered in the name of a child. Not Rener's name, not Ada's. 14 different children, first names, middle names, and last names spelled out in full. And every one of them the child of a family from that valley, the black ledger from under the till. 6 years of credit haircuts, some entries $1, some 4, 1 line reading 40 cents and shave, and every open account in it had been ruled through and marked in pencil on the same day. Paid in full, SR 4263, all of them, front to back, in one sitting. By a man who was never going to collect and had decided to make it official before he closed the door. A photograph of the shop, the chair in it, bright white, with a boy in the seat and a sheet to his chin. A brass maker's plate, unscrewed from under the right arm and laid in the tin with its 4 screws taped to it in a twist of paper. And a single sheet of shop paper folded once, written in a steady copperplate hand with a fountain pen. It said, in part, that the money in that tin had never belonged to him, that men who had gotten out of the valley and found work had come back through in the good years and put money in his hand for haircuts he had forgiven 10 and 15 years earlier, and that he had not been able to make any of them take it back, and had not been willing to keep it, that a man who takes payment for something he has already given away has cheated somebody, and he did not care for the arithmetic of it. So he had put it where it might turn into something, in the children's names, because the children had not been part of any of it. He wrote that he intended to hand them over himself when the youngest of the 14 turned 21, which would be 1979, and that he was aware he would be 93 years old and thought he had a fair chance at it. And he wrote, "Why the chair?" Because the chair had not been moved in 40 years and was not going to be. Because it weighed what it weighed. Because a paper in a drawer burns, and a drawer gets emptied by whoever comes after you, and nobody on this earth empties a chair. 7 months later, the stroke took the hand that wrote it, and the 14 names went quiet under a leather seat in a closed shop for 27 years. The bonds were the slow part. Series E bonds are registered securities. They belong to the named person, and they kept earning for 40 years. Emmett and Opal Teague, who ran the history room in Marrowbone, spent that winter with a phone book, a plat map, and a stack of high school yearbooks. Of the 14, 11 were still living. 3 had died, and their children took it. The bonds were redeemed in the spring of 1991 for a little over $19,000 all told. 2 of them Emmett drove to himself because he did not think it was a thing to do over a telephone. 1 woman in Dayton hung up on him twice on the reasonable grounds that a stranger calling about money is a stranger calling about money. Dwight Yeager was 41, a lineman with the Rural Electric, and he came out to the shed on a Sunday in his church clothes because he could not make sense of what he had been told. His bond had been bought in March of 1958 for $18.75 by a barber he could not remember at all. He read his own name in that copperplate hand, Dwight Allen Yeager, middle name and all, on a document older than his own memory, and then he sat down on the shop floor with his hat in his hands, and Emmett went and stood outside by the truck until he was finished. His father, Yeager said afterward, had never in his life mentioned owing anybody a haircut. And then there was the brass plate. Emmett had cleaned it with soap and a toothbrush the first night, and what came up was a maker's name he did not know. Lindauer and Company, Cincinnati, a serial number, and a line of engraving under it that had been cut by hand, not stamped, number 2 of 2. Made for the Pan American Exposition, Buffalo, 1901. That is why the nickel on the arms had a scroll he had never seen on a chair, and why a small-town barber had a chair that outclassed the shop it stood in. August Lindauer built fine chairs in Cincinnati for 11 years and burned out of business in 1913 with his records inside the building. Almost nothing survives with his name on it. Margaret Hurd came down from the city in February and spent the first 2 hours on her knees on that barn floor with a loop and a flashlight saying almost nothing, which Emmett respected more than anything she said afterward. She checked the serial in the base casting against the number on the plate, and she looked a long time at the way the porcelain rolled over the edge of the seat frame, a hand operation, done wet, that no production shop could afford twice. 2 chairs had been built for the exposition floor in Buffalo and finished by hand. Number 1 had gone out of the Lindauer Works in 1902 to a hotel barbershop in Cleveland and has never been seen since. Number 2 had spent 51 years in a narrow shop on Depot Street across from a woolen mill and 27 more behind a locked shop door and then in a hay barn holding 14 children's names under its seat the whole time. How Silas Rener came by it, nobody knows. Hurd's best guess was the receivership after the fire. That a young barber with a 1-year-old shop bought the finest chair in a bankrupt catalog for pennies on the dollar, knew exactly what he had, and took the brass plate off so that no stranger could ever read it. The chair sold in Chicago in September of 1991 for $118,000, with the photograph, the ledger, and the letter copied and sold alongside it, on the condition that they stay with it. It stands today in a museum case in Ohio. Emmett Barlow put a new roof on his house and a furnace under it. He gave Wes what the boy needed toward a welding rig and put the rest where Nadine could not be talked out of a winter again. And he paid to have Silas Rener's stone taken up and recut because the county's version, done in a hurry in 1971 by people who did not know him, had spelled Silas with a Y. He kept two things out of it: the steel check ball in its pill bottle, and the coffee cup of upholstery tacks, which he never did use because the museum had its own people for that. Dale Kreitz came around that spring and stood looking at the empty square of carpet in the shed for a good while before he said anything. What he finally said was that he had been buying by the pound for 30 years and had never once, in all that time, thought to ask what was inside. Which was the whole thing, really. A dry pump does not fight you. It goes down easy and tells you there is nothing there. And for 27 years, everybody believed it. The auctioneer, the salvage man, the estate, the entire valley. Silas Rener had counted on exactly that. He sealed the heavy iron door that had nothing behind it, and he left the fortune under the soft part, under the seat, under the place where every man in that town had sat down and told him his troubles. Nobody bothered to turn the chair over. $45.